Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Shari Markson. The Prime Minister has landed in the US for the start of his diplomacy blitz. He'll visit China and Pacific Islands. But will Albanese make time for Israel like so many other foreign leaders have? Joe Hildebrand, Andrew Carswell and James Morrow will join me to discuss. Also tonight, the ABC to face a grilling over its anti-Israel bias and its ballooning budget. Senator Holly Hughes will be on the show ahead of her interrogation of the public broadcaster tomorrow. And members of New South Wales Waverley Council will be exposed as Hamas apologists as I exclusively reveal the move to oust one of the worst offenders. It's been 2 weeks since the terror attacks in Israel horrified and shocked us in their depravity. 2 weeks since the world we thought we knew in the 21st century of inclusiveness and equality was shaken, and it feels like it'll never be the same again. There are the immediate tragic victims of the terror attacks and the horrors inflicted, and their families are in deep mourning, and we join them in their sorrow. But now the entire Jewish community around the world are freshly vulnerable, because those barbarians who took the lives of Jewish civilians in the most unthinkable and inhumane manner are now being celebrated in Western communities globally. Over the weekend, in every corner of the globe, tens of thousands of people joined pro-Palestinian protests. Al-Qaeda flags reportedly seen on the streets during London's protests. And then these were the scenes in Sweden. From Sydney to Melbourne to London to Auckland to Berlin, the size of the crowds were massive. In every protest, it seemed hatred and bile and anti-Semitism. Instead of anger at Hamas, we saw unbridled anger towards Israel. The anti-Semitism within our Western democracies has now been completely exposed. As I say, Jews are freshly vulnerable. There has been no equivalent response in the wake of other recent terror attacks. The September 11 Twin Towers, they were never celebrated by hundreds of thousands or more globally. The ISIS beheadings were roundly condemned, and so too the London bombings in 2007. It would have been unthinkable for tens of thousands of people to take to the streets in every major city in the wake of these terror attacks and either celebrate the atrocities or side with those that committed them. And yet that's what we've seen in the wake of Hamas's brutality in Israel. And a warning, a lot of the content that we're about to talk about is highly distressing. But we've sadly seen solidarity not with Israel, but with Gaza, where the governing body Hamas has burnt and beheaded babies, killed children, and torn babies from pregnant women's stomachs. The terror group Hamas contests this. Their word should carry no weight. Our despicable media praising these protests, these marches as peaceful, are implicitly condoning anti-Semitism. The chants from the river to the sea call for the destruction of Israel and thereby the Jewish people. The fact the protests are occurring in the wake of the terror attacks sends the message that Jews aren't important, our lives don't matter and aren't worth defending. And you have to ask, why aren't all these protesters instead demanding the return of the 210 Jewish hostages, including little babies taken from their beds in early morning bloody raids? Why aren't these lefties and so-called feminists protesting against Hamas's brutal rape of teenage girls? Those attending these protests are not feminists. They're frauds. They're not compassionate humanists. They're frauds. There's a depression that I can tell you has quite clearly set in the Jewish community as we witness as a society the worst and most dangerous anti-Semitism we've seen in half a century. Anti-Semitism that I believe is legitimised by politicians who speak at these rallies, where anti-Semitic signs and slogans are freely waved. Writing in the Australian newspaper about all of this that's unfolded, columnist Henry Ergas wrote this about the protests. He said those Jew haters were out in force, disgracing Sydney's streets, even as Hamas was still butchering its way through southern Israel. If they weren't as vocal in subsequent marches, it was because the organisers specifically asked for the Jew-hating cries to be silenced. In doing so, they simply confirmed what everyone knows, that had the crowd been left to its own devices, the filth would have spewed like excrement from a burst sewer. It's actually heartbreaking that in this country we all love, we're seeing an imported hatred towards the Jewish community that's tolerated by political leaders, the media and law enforcement. The media, here in Australia and internationally, have been appalling. Most media outlets were quick to take Hamas's word as gospel that Israel bombed a hospital. It was a lie. And then they were slow to half-heartedly walk back that claim. How can media organisations seriously think that terrorists who would burn babies wouldn't lie? It was refreshing to see the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett accuse the EBC while he was on air with the BBC of bias and of lacking moral clarity.
And I understand that BBC has taken a side of on the Gazan side because all your questions are only about the Gazan civilians.
That's not true.
You haven't asked one question.
That's not
you haven't
true.
asked one question about those children. From the very beginning of this interview, you just are asking me about them.
Mr. Bennett,
it seems that you cared little about our side. Oh, it is.
Mr. Bennett, I began by talking about the hostages. And what I'm asking you about now is...
No, I'm not talking about the hostages. I'm talking about the babies that were murdered. And you keep on caring only about one side, but that is the BBC way. But let me tell you something. We're here protecting you. We don't need your protection. And if you think there's a balance here between two equal sides, then you are lacking moral clarity. And BBC, I must say, is lacking moral clarity.
He's so right. Now, have you noticed that media outlets and politicians have started calling for a ceasefire? A ceasefire. Now, this is deeply problematic, and let me explain why. A ceasefire may sound compassionate and peace-loving, but think about what people who propose a ceasefire are actually calling for. A ceasefire is accepting that Israel should have no response at all to the slaughter of Jewish men, women and children. Those calling for a ceasefire are again legitimising anti-Semitism. Henry Ergas, in his brilliant column, writes that there will no doubt be even louder calls from Hamas's supporters for an immediate ceasefire. Every aggressor, wrote the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, is a lover of peace. Every aggressor is a lover of peace. He wants his aggression to go unopposed. But to prevent aggression, we must fight. And fight Israel will, by whatever means suit it best, until it has achieved its objectives, no matter how many of the Islamists' useful idiots burn Israeli flags and chant anti-Semitic slogans. I suggest you read the whole of that Henry Ergas column in The Australian. It's brilliant, and he's going to be on my program later this week, so tune in every night. Now, I'm beginning to think that there is no longer a line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's impossible now to distinguish when the first begins and the other ends. The concepts are now inseparable. The anti-Semitism of the far right presents as swastikas. The anti-Semitism of the left is expressed against Israel as denying Israel's right to exist. It's a point Noa Tishby made when I spoke with her during her recent Sydney visit.
The one on the left is slightly more hidden. It's slightly more hidden because it's anti-Israel's sentiment, because it's denying the world's single Jewish state's right to exist. It's harder for people to actually understand that this is anti-Semitism, but it is. It's anti-Semitism 2.0.
Now, the situation in the Middle East will feature in talks between Joe Biden and Anthony Albanese, and our Prime Minister has arrived in Washington earlier today, our time.
There's no doubt that the focus of the world is on the unrest in the Middle East following Hamas's invasion and atrocities that were committed in Israel. And we will no doubt be talking about those issues. Australia and the United States are important partners. We will be having discussions.
It'll be interesting to see if Albanese is indeed in lockstep with America in its support of Israel when he has the likes of Ed Husic and Anne Ali and their constituencies on another page. And here was Secretary of State Antony Blinken again today, reiterating America's strong support for Israel.
Israel has not only the right, as we've said, but the obligation to defend itself. We're not in the business of second-guessing what they're doing. We are talking to them on a regular basis about how they do it.
Meanwhile, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has predicted that the war against Hamas would be a tougher fight than the 9-month campaign against ISIS in Mosul.
This may be a bit more difficult because of the underground network of tunnels and the fact that they've had a long time to prepare for a fight. So I think you'll see a fight that's characterized by a lot of IEDs, a lot of booby traps, and just really grinding activity going forward.
Adding to the complexity of this war is still the uncertainty over whether Iran and Lebanon will become directly involved. I mean, Iran is already involved, of course, through its funding of Hamas and Hezbollah. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went north near the border of Lebanon today, and he ordered this warning.
If Hezbollah goes to war with Israel, it will make the mistake of its life. We will cripple it with a force it cannot even imagine, and the consequences for it and the Lebanese state will be devastating.
And there's no question, if Israel has to battle enemies in the north and in the south, it will be increasingly difficult. In Israel, families are now saying farewell to their loved ones as young men and women are called up to defend the Jewish homeland. The hearts of their mothers and fathers, their wives, their husbands are in their chest. These are truly dark times. But the only option now is for Hamas to be destroyed in a war that Israel didn't ask for, didn't want, but has been forced upon it as it fights to bring home its stolen children, babies and families. Let's bring in now Sky News host James Morrow. James, the Prime Minister is, of course, embarking on an international diplomacy tour. He's starting with the US, where he landed earlier today, our time. Then he's going to head to China, the Pacific Islands. Peter Dutton has called for him to visit Israel. At the moment, that's not on his agenda. And yet we've seen that the German Chancellor has visited Israel, Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, and Emmanuel Macron and the Dutch Prime Minister are still going to visit. James, what do you think about this? Should Albanese be going to Israel in a show of support? And does the fact that he probably can't, does this show that the left faction of his party is dictating foreign policy?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that question there, Sherry. Yes, absolutely, he should go. He should. If all of these other leaders are making a support, it's incumbent upon Anthony Albanese, who represents a country with a significant Jewish population that did so much after World War II to resettle Jews displaced by the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities, to go and stand with Israel. Standing with Israel is standing with civilization. It's very simple. And I think anybody who doesn't get that has a very big problem. And the problem Anthony Albanese has is that Labour has now been dominated by people on the left who have, let's just say, a very problematic relationship with Israel. I think Bill Shorten may be the only person on the front benches there who's really quite sound on the topic. But, you know, we've seen two ministers, one in cabinet, break from the solidarity on the subject of Israel. But, you know, there's a much bigger issue here. And as I said, standing with Israel is to stand with civilization. There's no other way to talk about it when you're talking about the butchery of Hamas, which wants to eliminate Israel, eliminate worldwide Judaism according to their charter. When people tell you who they are, believe them. That's what I always say. And that is the fact that the left has become so infected, and this has been going on, by the way, for decades. You can trace it back to the 60s, has been so infected with this sort of self-abasing, self-hating ideology that says any sort of decolonizing imperative, no matter how violent, how disgraceful it behaves, must somehow be celebrated. And that is, I think, an intellectual fight that we need to have here in the universities, in the schools, on our campuses, sadly in our corporations, on our streets, in our societies. Because until we, you know, deal with that, we're going to keep seeing people doing this sort of moral both-sidism and worse when it comes to Israel.
No, I completely agree with you, James. We are seeing this bizarre equivalence between a terror organisation and Israel. Now, James, support for Labor has fallen in Victoria and Western Australia, according to today's news poll in The Australian. It shows that male and younger voters nationally are also turning away from the ALP. Although Labor does still lead the coalition in two-party preferred support, the margin has narrowed, though, 54 to 46 compared to 6 months ago. It was 58 to 42. What do you make of these news poll results today?
Yeah, well, a couple of more interesting things, too, in that. Number one, the fact that Labor is really on the nose with the Greens in a lot of areas. And so this we see a real pincer movement forming. You know, you've got the Liberals on one side and the Greens on the other. The Greens, and again, this kind of goes back to your previous question, too. The Greens in inner city areas are really, really giving them a run for their money. And I think they're very concerned about that. That's what's sort of dragging them to the left. The other interesting thing to me is that bit you mentioned about younger people and men sliding away from Labor. To me, this is mimicking the same shift away from the Yes campaign that we saw during the referendum. And I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see other demographics start to fall in that direction as well.
James, just finally, today we saw the transcript from that police body cam footage released. Just to remind everyone, this is about Claire Noland. She was the frail 95-year-old who was suffering from dementia. She was in a nursing home when police tasered her and she died. The transcript from that body cam footage today released. One of the officers involved, Senior Constable Christian White, reportedly said, "We're not playing this game, Claire. You're going to put that down." Just remember, this is a 95-year-old weighing 45 kilograms that he was speaking to. She was holding a knife. He said, "This is your first warning. You see this? This is a taser. Drop it now. Stop now. Don't think I'm going to give you another warning." I mean, she had dementia. Less than a minute later, James, less than a minute later, it's alleged that White then says, "Nah, bugger it, bugger it." And then he fires the taser less than 2 meters away at Claire. She then fell from her walker, hit her head, and she died. James, understandably, the family is suing the state for negligence.
Yeah, look, and you can see why. I mean, it sounds just on the face of it pretty shocking right there. It's quite interesting, of course, you contrast the behavior of the police there when dealing with a 45-kilogram, 95-year-old dementia patient and the way they dealt with protesters at the Opera House the other night. One common thread, of course, in both those stories is Police Minister Yasmin Catley, who mishandled the Claire Noland story terribly. I think has also performed terribly during these protests we've had in Sydney. I really am surprised that Chris Minns hasn't given her her marching orders yet.
Yeah, look, there's been a lot of scandals piling up against Yasmin Catley, the Police Minister in New South Wales, so you think that she won't be... How long can she hang on in the job? James Murray, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Now, coming up, an Israeli politician gives us the latest on-the-ground information as the IDF escalates its airstrikes in Gaza ahead of a ground invasion. plus the royal welcome for Albanese as he lands in the US. We'll speak about this after the break. Welcome back. Well, the Prime Minister has arrived in the United States as part of a 4-day trip to convince Congress to vote through billions of dollars in funding for the AUKUS nuclear submarine project. He'll meet with President Biden and the First Lady for a state dinner on Wednesday night. But with Republicans still in deadlock over whether Jim Jordan should be the next Speaker of the House, will Albanese's visit be overshadowed by both Israel and domestic politics? Sky News contributor Kosha Garda joins me now. Thanks so much for your time. What would a successful trip in the United States look like for Albanese?
Great to be with you, Shari. Look, there's obviously the surface level agenda, obviously the AUKUS deal that he's there for, and seeing some movement in the positive direction and messaging coming out of that in support of what Prime Minister Albanese is going with would be a success. There's always the second order agenda for whenever there are state visits between leaders, because leaders, as we know, are always speaking to multiple audiences at once. And so when we look at all the other issues that are gripping the world right now, whether it's national unity back home, whether it's the economy and the impact that the U.S. has on that, whether it's national defense, whether it's showing allegiance with foreign conflicts in Israel, Ukraine, and elsewhere, I think getting some messaging out of that in favor of Prime Minister Albanese would be successful. But I think, to be honest, a lot of people tune these trips out, and I'm not sure how much they're paying attention.
Look, Joe Biden has clearly been trying at least to play a leadership role in the Middle East. He's been to Israel. He's had numerous phone calls with Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, his meeting with Arab leaders was cancelled. Do you think he is doing enough as the leader of the free world to try and help resolve this situation, get the hostages back? Is he putting enough pressure on Hamas and on Egypt?
You know, the U.S. is a nation divided, increasingly divided. And I think because of that, the answer to that question, Shari, is never going to have consensus support. Because back to that point of leaders always speaking to multiple audiences, President Biden is obviously wanting to signal strength to the world as the leader of the free world. Back home, though, there are clear lines of division in his own party. There are many people that see this conflict differently or have sympathy maybe a little bit more for the Hamas side of the equation than not, and he's got to balance that in his own party. There's also this divide between the working class and sort of the populist wing, both from the left and the right, and the so-called establishment, where the former, you know, as much as they sympathize with the people that were victims of these atrocities, they just do not believe the country should be intervening, should be sending funding, should be sending troops if it ever came to that. And they really want a return to self-reliance and a focus on domestic issues. So with that always sort of gnawing at him, it's really difficult. I think each layer between diplomacy, financial and economic support, and military support, he's got a lot of turmoil back home to deal with. And I think because of that, his hands are sort of tied behind his back. He's also not the most strong speaker, though I will say his messaging on Israel has generally been on point, though, you know, he doesn't come across as somebody that conveys a lot of strength, as we discuss week to week.
Look, we've just seen that the US has announced $100 million in funding in aid for Gaza. $100 million. I mean, we've seen a lot of evidence over the years of international aid being misused, being stolen by Hamas, and then used for terrorism, used for weaponry, and the aid hasn't actually gone to the innocent Palestinians. You know, how much concern is there that $100 million could end up in the hands of Hamas?
A lot. I think that's a great question. And just this whole framework of money sloshing around out there in the world, or arms or other support and cash or a kind, is increasingly becoming a cause for concern, because to your point, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of intermediaries that take things along the way. There's a lot of laundering that happens, not just directly this aid, but there's been a lot of discussion coming out about, you know, even things like funding the Ukrainian front. How much of that gets laundered through and finds its way back into the hands of bad actors here? Hamas or elsewhere in the world. So I think that goes back to the point I was saying that a lot of people, the public back home, are fed up really about all funding, aid, humanitarian or direct help, because there's a low level and an increasingly declining level of trust in how well that money is being handled and is it actually reaching the intended target.
Look, we saw some amazing news in the past 24 hours, the release of 2 American-Israeli hostages, a mother and a daughter. Why were only 2 of the Americans released? Why were American hostages released and not any other nationality? And what role did Qatar play in all of this?
Very, very interesting. The official view seems to be that it was for optics because this was a mother and daughter duo, very sympathetic just by that nature. I think they were connected to an NBC News correspondent, and so the cynical side would suggest that maybe there was some connections there, or Hamas knew that it'll get extra amplification in the media because of that. And they're trying to signal, we do care about the humanitarian thing, even though nobody's buying that. Obviously, we've seen what they're capable of. And I think in terms of the Qatar thing, that's another big topic that I think I'm so glad you asked that, because not many people are focusing on it, where when we say what can the West do, what can Biden do, what can leaders do to really put pressure on Hamas, that is something that comes up all the time. We know that a lot of their leaders are living in Qatar. Qatar sends a lot of money and it has a very effective lobbying group into Washington, D.C., and so that raises a lot of eyebrows and a lot of questions about why isn't more pressure being put to bear there, and maybe there was some of that dynamic coming to play behind the scenes with these 2 hostages that were released.
Yeah. All right, Kosha Gad, I really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for your time. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has told troops that Israelis are in a battle for their lives and the war against Hamas is a do-or-die situation.
If Hezbollah goes to war with Israel, it will make the mistake of its life. We will cripple it with a force it cannot even imagine, and the consequences for it and the Lebanese state will be devastating.
Joining me now is Sharon Haskell, a member of the Israeli Parliament, or Knesset. Sharon, so good to see you again. Now, Israel has stepped up its airstrikes. Israel has stepped up its airstrikes on Gaza. This is said to be to make it slightly safer. I mean, it's never going to be safe, but slightly safer for the ground invasion for the Israeli soldiers when that eventually does happen. How risky is this mission, and when do you think it will actually happen? Because it's been, a couple of weeks now. Do you expect the ground incursion will happen this week?
It's very, very difficult to say that, especially on media, because Hamas and its allies are following all of the interviews of Knesset members and ministers in Israel to try and get some assessments of when this will happen. I can tell you that it's coming soon, and it will happen on Israel's terms. It means that we are trying to destroy as much ammunition bunkers as possible before we go in. I mean, we're not blind, and definitely the Israeli army is well trained and well known, and we know that they have prepared some surprise. They knew that we will enter there with forces. And so we are trying to dry up some of their ammunition and also to, really make them exhausted, because they are underground, in bunkers, in tunnels. Some of there are, from what I've been told, some are almost 100 meters deep. And so the less food, the less water they will have available in those bunkers, the more likely they will come out. And so this war will be a little bit easier on our troops. So it will happen on Israel's terms when we feel it's safe, not safe, but that we have used all of the options and that we prepared some of the ground for the entrance.
Look, President Herzog just did an interview with Sky News International, and he says that a Hamas terrorist was carrying instructions on how to build chemical weapons. It was a B drive. Do you have more detail on this? And is this a concern that there might be chemical weapons inside Gaza?
Well, yes. I mean, we understand that their plans were far more reaching than what they were capable of doing. I mean, this invasion, who was devastating. I mean, this was one of the worst massacres that we've experienced through the entire history of Israel. But their plans were much bigger. From what we've investigated, and we are still investigating, just to say yesterday, one of the Hamas forces of their elite unit was captured next to one of the towns in the fields close to the border with Gaza. And so they are still being investigated, but the scope of what they plan to do is absolutely massive and devastating, using some chemical weapons. It is already known that they have used drugs as well that are made in Syria, that some of the soldiers in Syria have used as well. So, I mean, yeah, this is another level. And the footprint of Iran is straight on the information that we're receiving.
Well, look, speaking of Iran and then Lebanon, how concerned is the Knesset about a serious conflict, you know, another war opening up on the northern front against Hezbollah?
So, of course, we don't want another war. We don't want another fight. We didn't want this war either. We were forced into this war. And unfortunately, you know, I really hope Hezbollah will not force us into this war. They will lose as well. I mean, if Hezbollah wants to turn Beirut into Gaza, then they should start this war as well. And you know, Australians need to understand, Hezbollah is another proxy of Iran. This is an army of Iran sitting in Lebanon, creating chaos for Lebanese as well, as much as for Israelis. I mean, there have been in a very difficult political, economical situation in recent years because of Hezbollah as well. The massive explosion that we saw in Beirut as well was done because of Hezbollah's equipment as well. That was a devastating event. And so Iran is controlling a full army, a very powerful army in the south of Lebanon too. And so if we need, we will open this front as well. I mean, we will defend our people. We will defend our country. We prefer not to go into a war with Lebanon. But unfortunately, if Iran decide to send Hezbollah through the border again, unfortunately, we will be forced to turn Beirut into Gaza as well.
Wow, a very strong warning there. Sharon Heskel, member of the Israeli Parliament, or Knesset, I really appreciate your time once again. And again, sending love and all of our prayers to all your people, to Israel.
Thank you so much, Shari. And thanks for all the support and the prayer for our people. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sharon. Now, coming up, Hamas apologists on a local council exposed, and I'll exclusively reveal the move to oust one of the worst offenders. Plus, businesses will be forced to report on the climate emissions of their employees when they're travelling to work. This is an outrageous new rule. Front page of the Fin today. I'll speak about it with Joe Hildebrand and Andrew Carswell after the break. If you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. The Prime Minister has touched down in the United States to begin his 4-day trip to talk renewable energy and AUKUS. Yes campaigners have broken their week of silence to slam the no vote as appalling and mean-spirited, urging the government to set up a voice without constitutional change or legislation. Labor MPs will front a parliamentary inquiry into the cancelled Commonwealth Games for the first time, as it's revealed Victoria has still not paid the $380 million in compensation. An Israeli member of parliament has exclusively told us that if Iran sends Hezbollah into conflict with Israel, Israel will have no choice but to turn Beirut into Gaza. And fast-moving bushfires are burning in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales, with some residents told to enact their bushfire survival plans. Waverley Council in New South Wales, the deputy mayor there has come under fire after he refused to support a motion condemning the horrific terror attacks by Hamas. Ludovico Fabiano was one of the 2 Greens councillors who said that they weren't able to support the motion condemning Hamas as it didn't reflect the atrocities from, and I quote, both sides. There's been a major backlash from Waverley residents, businesses and the Jewish community. Well, tonight we can exclusively reveal there's now a move to sack the Deputy Mayor from his position. Liberal councillor Will Nemish has called an extraordinary council meeting this Thursday evening to declare the position of Deputy Mayor vacant. He told me today he's confident he'll have the numbers on council to remove Fabiano from his role if he doesn't resign before then. Well, joining me now to discuss all of this is Sky News contributor Joe Hildebrand. Great to see you, Joe.
G'day, Shari. Lovely to be here.
And Director of Headline Advisory, Andrew Carswell in Canberra.
Hey, Shari.
Joe, I mean, it's kind of unfathomable. Why won't these Green councillors just condemn Hamas without having to try equate Hamas with Israel?
Again, it's this extraordinary thing. It's like, oh, I can't possibly condemn this act of terror, this terrorist atrocity, because there's been some other violence or other death somewhere else, somewhere in the past, or there might come somewhere in the future, or it's just insane. And there just seems to be no kind of human decency to any of these responses. They all seem to be dead-eyed, ideologically based. I was listening to a podcast coming in here about the experiences of Berliners during the Second World War, and they were saying that Berliners had never really told the story of how much they'd suffered during the Second World War, because compared to the atrocities of the Holocaust, the millions and millions of Jews killed, and let's not forget, we're talking about Jews being killed here again for being Jewish, that they felt that, it just wasn't right for them to say, well, actually, we suffered too. And I just think, wouldn't it be amazing if the Greens had that tiny little kernel of self-awareness, that tiny little bit of grace? But of course, it's too much for them. They're ideologically wedded to supporting Hamas, basically. No matter how they dress it up or slice it and dice it, they're in league with a terrorist organisation that supports the annihilation of Israel. And they basically have sort of painted themselves into this corner, and hopefully he'll get painted all the way out of council.
Andrew Carswell, at the start of the show, in my editorial, I spoke about the protests that we saw around the world over the weekend. Literally hundreds of thousands of people turning out to support. I mean, it's in the wake of the terror attacks, right? So they're supposedly celebrating these terror attacks, or at least not condemning them. These aren't protests condemning the terror attacks. These aren't protests condemning Hamas. They're condemning Israel. Don't you think it's just heartbreaking what we're seeing before our very eyes in this time when supposedly we're meant to all be inclusive and woke and have empathy and care about the victims? None of this is happening.
Well, I think it's atrocious, Shari, and it says a lot about the human condition of some people. And people like to jump up and down and say, oh, these are peaceful protests. No. It doesn't matter if you've got a weapon or not. If you are actively saying free Palestine from the river to the sea, you are advocating for the erasure of Israel from the map. You want to push them into the Mediterranean. That is not a peaceful claim. And anything that suggests that should be treated as hate speech. But in terms of the councillors that are jumping on board here, yes, it's a Greens-led position here, but it shows a gross understanding of not only who their constituents are. You're either Jewish or in Waverley, or you live next door to one or across the road from a Jewish family. So they're a very tight-knit Jewish community. But I think if we can't be unequivocal here. If you are not condemning these atrocious acts by Hamas, if you are equating those atrocious acts against the Israeli people with a justified defence of a sovereign nation, then you are not pro-Palestinian. You hate Israel fundamentally and everything Israel stands for.
Yeah, exactly right. There's such strong comments there, Andrew. Now, look, I want to turn to Heston Russell. We spoke last week about how he won his defamation case against the ABC. Now, you'll remember it was revealed that the ABC, their supposedly incredible investigative unit, had relied on a witness who said he had a foggy memory. And they relied on this one witness to accuse Heston Russell of war crimes. Well, that witness, who went by the name Josh in the ABC's evidence, but whose name is actually Dean, well, he wrote to Heston Russell to apologise. He said, and this was revealed on Ben Fordham's show today, he said, I had no experience with that type of media interaction in the past, and this has been a lesson learned about how my intentions may not have matched with the intention of the people I spoke with. He was speaking about the ABC journalists. He said, I was naive about how everything would play out, and in retrospect, should have been much more thoughtful about what was shared. I have no plans about ever speaking to the media about what happened over there and your unit again, and I'm sorry, my lesson learned came at your expense. Now, Heston came on this show a week ago, and he said that that ABC report took him to some very dark places.
One of the most amazing experiences in my entire career was the ability to fly around the world and take the fight to those who would target and bully innocent people. And I've encountered my greatest enemy at home, being the ABC, who targeted me and my soldiers, and the impact it's had on me, my mental health, my family, my mother, those who've had to pick up the pieces behind the scenes.
Joe, he fought the Taliban. He said he encountered his greatest enemy here. Yeah. He's basically saying the ABC is worse than the Taliban. Yeah,
you've heard me talk about ideology and just in the last answer with the Greens and their support effectively of Hamas. And again, it seems to be the same thing operating in here. And it sounds like a sort of benign word, but it's a word that for me sums up what I despise and fear and hate most about political activism, where the ideology becomes more important than any rationality and also any humanity. And so we have in this situation, and sadly it is not the first time for the ABC, where they seem to have already decided that Heston was guilty and then sought to sort of assemble a case against it. And we saw a similar thing in their pursuit of Christian Porter, the pursuit of George Pell, Andrew Laming. I mean, the list just goes on. And again, they've been forced into a horrendous embarrassment. They've been forced to pay damages. And this, again, happens again and again. But they never seem to accidentally target a left-winger. They never seem to accidentally destroy the reputation of Adam Bandt or someone from the Labor Party. So it's always these arch-conservative figures or figures they perceive as being the conservative or whatever it may be, or soldiers, for example. And again and again, they get caught out basically either falling for the most spurious evidence and most implausible evidence, or indeed just, I mean, there's hardly any evidence here whatsoever.
Like a pop
in the background, and that means that Heston must have shot someone in cold blood. How on earth do you actually take that to air? I don't understand.
Crazy. Now, Andrew Carswell, I want to ask you about this story that was on the front page of the Fin Review today. I couldn't believe it when I was even reading it. Small businesses will they're going to be forced to fill out compulsory climate disclosures. These are the same as those filled out by some of the biggest corporates in Australia. And they're shortly going to have to start recording carbon emissions caused by employees who are commuting to work or going on business trips. Andrew, I mean, we're in a cost of living crisis. Small businesses are struggling to even stay afloat. And now they're going to have to find time to report on the climate emissions of their employees. Is the government serious?
It's frightening, and the federal government and its agencies are completely addicted to pouring more pain and more burdens on small business and large businesses in this country. They're completely addicted to it. And, getting to net zero by 2050 is going to be an extremely difficult task. It's an arduous task to undertake, and businesses will wear the cost of that. And they are doing everything they can to clear what are pretty substantial hurdles. But the bar has been set pretty high for them to leap over here in terms of reaching their emissions and decarbonising the economy. And as I said, that burden is being met by businesses. And you've got businesses that are captured by the emissions intensive scheme that are going to reduce their emissions at a far greater rate than the government wants them to. That is how committed industry are to do this. But the bar just keeps getting higher and higher. More red tape, more green tape, more hurdles for businesses to jump over. And we need investment in this country. More investment right now, more than at any other time in the last decade. And investors are sitting on the horizon going, well, do I invest in Australia where there's a high energy cost, where there's an industrial relations regime that is rigid, and where there is red tape and green tape every step I take? No, thank you.
All right. Yeah. Joe Hildebrand, thank you so much for joining me. Andrew Carswell, great to see you both, as always, on a Monday. After the break, Senator Holly Hughes will join me. We'll speak about ABC's anti-Israel bias and its growing legal bill. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, Liberal Senator Holly Hughes will be one of those grilling the ABC and its chiefs tomorrow at Senate Estimates. She joins me now. Holly, welcome to the program. What details will you be seeking? What details will you be seeking from the ABC around its expenditure on The Voice?
Well, I mean, I have multiple concerns that we'll be looking at. Unfortunately, we've only got the ABC with us for 2.5 hours, and I'm absolutely sure that that's not going to be long enough with the number of things that we need to go through. There's going to be a raft of issues on The Voice. We know that there were a lot of claims made. So, for example, Dana Morse made a claim on insiders that genocide was ongoing, and yet this was not picked up, it was not stopped, it was not ever corrected. There's been a whole raft of issues around coverage of The Voice, including whether press club addresses were going to be shown on ABC's channels, how much money was spent sending staff to Gama, and there's a few other issues that we'll be looking at tomorrow with the ABC. But this is coupled with, you know, the Four Corners episode at Meg O'Neill's house in City Beach, where they turned up at her place with some activists. On her front lawn. You just touched on Heston Russell, but what they're doing with the legal fees and the number of cases that they've lost. You know, when it comes out to Heston, not only do they have to pay him damages, but they're going to have costs awarded, and there'll also be their costs on top of that. So we're probably looking around $3.5 million plus the ABC has expended on this. And this is when Heston had, you know, simply asked for an apology very early in the piece. But there's also issues around their pay structure and, of course, how their coverage of what's happening in Israel and Gaza at the moment is occurring. So there's a lot to cover, as I said, and only 2.5 hours, and a lot of senators that are going to want to come in and ask questions.
Now, Holly, you gave a very strong speech supporting Israel in the Senate. I'm going to play a clip of it later in the week. But you know, we are seeing, as you just referred to, this strong bias against Israel by parts of the public broadcaster. What do you want to ask them? Are you going to be grilling the chiefs about why we are seeing this?
Well, I mean, just a couple of months ago in a previous Estimates, I raised with the managing director an issue with regards to a stringer that they had over there, a producer and cameraman, who we had anti-Semitic tweets from. He was let go after an internal investigation, but no details have been provided on, you know, how much money he was paid or what was the, you know, how that issue was settled with Mr Abu Ghosh. So this is something that we've seen time and time again, and I think we just saw with Tom Joyner calling out the beheading of babies as BS. But we've also got issues with a headline they played about and had up that a Palestinian had been shot when it actually turned out that it was an attempted suicide bombing Palestinian who was shot by Israeli police, and that had to be changed. And this is just an ongoing theme with the ABC. They seem to just have one view of the world, and until it can be proven completely the other way, they refuse to back down, they refuse to correct the record, and they automatically assume that their position is the right one. This is the publicly funded broadcaster. They have to do better. This isn't the first time issues have been raised with them, yet it just seems to be getting continually worse, whilst we're seeing Mr Anderson's salary package now almost double that of the Prime Minister.
Well, and in fact, I noticed that the salary packages are about $32 million over budget this year for the ABC. So, look, we're going to cover this, how the estimates go, tomorrow night on the show. Holly Hughes, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Shari.
Now, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back tomorrow at 5 o'clock, and stay tuned now. Corey Bernardi is filling in for Peter Credlin.